Success on the NPPE is not a matter of luck, it is a matter of strategy. We have meticulously developed 46 high-caliber questions designed to forge the professional mindset you need to command this exam with surgical precision. These are not just practice problems, they are definitive frameworks that turn complex ethical dilemmas into clear professional wins. Stay with me until the very end. This is the essential bridge between where you are right now and your professional license. Let us engineer your success. Mindset 1 Scenario Question. An engineer is retained to assess structural safety of a commercial complex which was built decades earlier, similar in design to the Elliott Lake Algo Center Mall. Inspection reports identify long-term water leakage and corrosion of load-bearing elements. The owner and municipality argue that previous engineers approved continued use and that closure would cause economic hardship and public backlash. They request the engineer to certify the structure as safe while planning future repairs. No collapse has occurred, but deterioration is ongoing. Based on professional self-regulation obligations, what is the most appropriate action? A. Approve continued occupancy based on previous approvals and lack of incidents. B. Approve conditionally while recommending monitoring and delayed repairs. C. Refuse certification until structural remediation addresses identified safety risks. D. Transfer responsibility to municipal authorities by documenting concerns only. The correct answer is C. Refuse certification until structural remediation addresses identified safety risks. The Elliott Lake inquiry confirmed that reliance on past approvals and tolerance of visible deterioration directly undermines professional self-regulation. Applying this mindset, the engineer must act independently of economic or political pressure. Conditional approval or documentation alone does not remove accountability once professional certification is granted. Self-regulation requires refusing approval when safety cannot be reasonably assured even without prior incidents. Public trust rests on professionals exercising judgment, not accommodating convenience. Refusal until remediation aligns with regulatory expectations and demonstrates why society entrusts engineers with self-regulatory authority. Mindset 2 Scenario Question. A municipal engineer reviews water quality data from a shallow groundwater well supplying a small community. Test results show intermittent bacteria presence during heavy rainfall, like conditions identified before the Walkerton outbreak. Current treatment meets regulatory minimums, but additional safeguards would require temporary shutdown and capital expense. Municipal leaders insist the risk is theoretical, no illnesses have been reported, and disruption would cause public panic. Based on professional responsibility to public welfare, what should guide the engineer's decision? A. Maintain operation because regulatory compliance has technically been achieved. B. Delay action until confirmed illness or regulatory enforcement occurs. C. Recommend additional protective measures despite cost and political resistance. D. Defer responsibility to elected officials through formal written warnings. The correct answer is C. Recommend additional protective measures despite cost and political resistance. Justice O'Connor's Walkerton inquiry established that waiting for illness before acting constitutes professional failure. Applying the public welfare paramount mindset, the engineer must act on foreseeable risk, not political convenience. Regulatory compliance alone is insufficient when evidence indicates potential harm. Deferring responsibility or delaying action undermines public protection and professional accountability. Proactively recommended safeguards aligns with professional duty to prevent harm and reflects lessons from Walkerton, where early intervention could have saved lives. Mindset 3, scenario question. A supervising engineer approves drawings for a public waste transfer facility prepared by junior staff without independently assessing safety measures. Following commissioning, multiple users are injured due to insufficient fall protection, similar to the circumstances in Lovely versus Kamloops. The supervising engineer argues that the junior designer produced the layout and that project timelines limited reviews. From a professional accountability perspective, which conclusion is correct? A. Responsibility rests with junior staff who prepared the design documents. B. Responsibility is shared equally among the entire project team. C. The supervising engineer remains accountable for approving unsafe designs. D. Responsibility lies solely with the facility owner once operation begins. The correct answer is C. The supervising engineer remains accountable for approving unsafe designs. In Lovely versus Kamloops, the court affirmed that supervising engineers remain liable for approved designs affecting public safety. Delegation does not transfer professional duty of care. By approving drawings, the engineer exercised judgment and assumed responsibility regardless of who prepared them. Time constraints and reliance on subordinates do not excuse diminished oversight. NPPE questions reinforce that supervision equates to ownership. Consequently, approving work without verifying safety measures constitutes a breach of professional responsibility. The correct answer is C. Provincial or territorial regulators control licensure and legal practice. Professional acts clearly establish provincial regulators as the sole licensing authorities. Employer approval and national standards do not authorize practice. Assigning professional judgment to unlicensed individuals undermines public protection and violates statute. NPPE questions treat jurisdictional clarity as functional knowledge. Selecting provincial authority reflects correct understanding of Canadian professional regulation. Mindset 5 Scenario Question. An engineering firm evaluates design alternatives for a public bridge. One option minimizes upfront cost but increases maintenance and long-term structural risk. Another has higher initial cost but significantly improves durability and safety. Political leaders prefer the cheaper option to remain within current budgets. From a professional values perspective, what should guide the firm's recommendation? A. Lowest upfront cost to respect current funding limitation. B. Fast delivery schedule to satisfy political expectations. C. Long-term safety, maintenance, and societal impact. D. Option offering greatest immediate profit to the firm. The correct answer is C. Long-term safety, maintenance, and societal impact. Historical failures such as the Quebec Bridge collapse illustrate that neglecting long-term consequences in favor of immediate savings leads to tragic outcomes. Applying the societal value mindset, engineers must evaluate how designs perform over their full life cycle. Political preference and short-term economics do not define professional value. NPPE questions emphasize sustainability, public safety, and long-term stewardship. Recommending the option that enhances durability and safety fulfills professional duty to future users and maintains public trust in engineering judgment. Mindset number 6, scenario question. A Canadian engineering firm working abroad is asked to approve facilitation payments to local officials to expedite permitting. Senior managers argue the payments are legal under local law and common business practice. The engineer recalls lessons from the SNC-Lavalin corruption cases, where executives were criminally convicted despite arguments that bribery was culturally normalized overseas. The engineer is told refusal may delay the project and risk future work. No Canadian laws appear immediately violated. From an NPPE ethics perspective, what is the most appropriate response? A. Approve payment because local laws permit it and management supports decision. B. Approve payment since project delays could harm employees and community. C. Delegate approval decision to management to avoid personal involvement. D. Refuse participation because ethical duties require integrity beyond legality. The correct answer is D. Refuse participation because ethical duties require integrity beyond legality. The SNC-Lavalin cases demonstrate that conduct justified as normal business practice can still violate ethical obligations and destroy public trust, even if local law permits it. Applying the ethics beyond law mindset, engineers must uphold integrity regardless of jurisdiction. Cultural acceptance and managerial pressure do not negate ethical responsibility. Delegation does not absolve accountability. NPPE ethics questions consistently emphasize that professionals must act in ways that preserve confidence in the profession globally. Refusing participation reinforces transparency, independence, and societal trust values central to Canadian professional ethics. Mindset 7, scenario question. A professional geoscientist must choose between two mining development strategies. One option provides modest economic benefit to a local community, but risks minor environmental disruption. Another option preserves the environment entirely, but restricts economic opportunity. The geoscientist recalls the P.Eng scandal, where exaggerated benefits and ignored risks caused immense public harm and loss of trust. Both options are legal and acceptable to the client. Which ethical approach best aligns with professional obligation? A. Select option producing greatest overall benefit while managing environmental impact. B. Select option maximizing client profit regardless of broader consequences. C. Choose approach minimizing professional criticism and personal reputational risk. D. Defer decision entirely to client preference to avoid ethical responsibility. The correct answer is option A. Select option producing greatest overall benefit while managing environmental impacts. The P.Eng scandal illustrates how overstating benefits and neglecting ethical evaluation destroys trust even when activities appear permissible. Applying ethical logic reasoning, professionals must assess societal benefit while mitigating foreseeable harm. Option A reflects balanced reasoning, maximizing benefits without ignoring environmental responsibility. Choices driven by client profit, personal reputation, or avoidance of judgment undermine ethical obligations. NPPE questions reward applied judgment that considers broader societal outcomes rather than rigid rules or self-interest. Ethical reasoning here focuses on responsible benefit distribution and harm reduction. These are core expectations of professional integrity. Mindset 8. Scenario question. A professional engineer contributes to investor presentations for a resource project. The materials slightly exaggerate estimated reserves and the engineer's personal involvement. Management argues this is normal promotional practice and that no laws are broken. The engineer recalls how misleading disclosure during the P.Eng scandal led to sweeping regulatory reform and loss of public trust. No investor complaints have been made. Under NPPE ethics principles, how should this conduct be assessed? A. Acceptable because promotional exaggeration is common and legally permitted. B. Acceptable provided no investor loss or regulatory action occurs. C. Unethical because codes require truthful, accurate professional representation. D. Acceptable if approved by senior management and legal counsel. The correct answer is C. Unethical because codes require truthful, accurate professional representation. The P.Eng scandal resulted in regulatory reforms precisely because misleading representations, even before harm, violate public trust. Applying the enforceable codes mindset, ethical obligations extend beyond legality and management approval. Misrepresentation undermines integrity and exposes professionals to discipline regardless of outcome. NPPE ethics questions emphasize that honesty is not negotiable. Ethical codes demand accurate communication, to prevent deception and maintain confidence in professional judgment. Therefore, exaggerated claims violate ethical standards even if losses have not yet occurred. Mindset number 9, scenario question. A professional engineer sits on a procurement committee evaluating bids for a municipal water treatment upgrade. One bidder employs a close family member. The engineer believes she can remain impartial and recalls Walkerton, where governance failures and opacity contributed to severe public harm. She has not disclosed the relationship. From an NPPE ethics perspective, what is the most appropriate action? A. Participate fully because personal activity can be reasonably maintained. B. Disclose the relationship immediately to committee and withdraw if required. C. Apply stricter scrutiny to related bidder without disclosure. D. Complete evaluation first and disclose only if issues emerge. The correct answer is B. Disclose the relationship immediately to committee and withdraw if required. The Walkerton inquiry demonstrated that transparency failures compound risk and erode public trust. Applying the conflict of interest mindset, early disclosure is mandatory regardless of perceived objectivity. Undisclosed relationships undermine credibility even if decisions are technically fair. Increased scrutiny without disclosure does not resolve ethical risk. NPPE questions consistently emphasize disclosure before action, allowing appropriate management or recusal. Immediate transparency protects decision integrity and public confidence in professional judgment. Mindset 10, scenario question. A professional engineer employed by a large mining corporation approves a design change to speed construction despite internal memos warning of increased structural risk. The change contributes to a partial failure similar to historical warnings ignored during the Quebec Bridge project. Management argues the engineer followed corporate approval processes and acted within her job duties. The engineer claims responsibility lies with the corporation, not her personally, because she was an employee and did not financially benefit. From a professional practice perspective, how should responsibility be understood? A. Responsibility lies with the employer because decision followed corporate governance procedures. B. Responsibility lies with employer because engineer acted within employment scope. C. Responsibility remains with engineer who exercise professional judgment, approving change. D. Responsibility is eliminated because decision was made collectively by organization. The correct answer is C. Responsibility remains with engineer who exercise professional judgment approving change. The Quebec Bridge collapse illustrates that professional responsibility attaches to judgment, not position. Engineers who ignored warnings were held accountable because they approved unsafe decisions. Applying this mindset, the engineer's employment status does not shield her from responsibility once she exercises professional judgment. Corporate procedures and collective decision making do not transfer accountability away from licensed professionals. NPPE questions consistently emphasize that licensure imposes personal responsibility to protect the public. Therefore, the engineer remains professionally accountable for approving the design change, regardless of employer involvement or lack of personal gain. Mindset 11, scenario question. An engineer overseeing fuel transport infrastructure becomes aware of multiple reports identifying risks like those preceding the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster, including inadequate braking safeguards and staffing reductions. Although current operations meet minimum regulatory requirements, the engineer does not pursue further risk analysis due to budget constraints and management assurances. A derailment later occurs, causing environmental damage. Management argues regulatory compliance demonstrates due diligence. From a professional practice perspective, which assessment is most accurate? A. Due diligence was met because all regulatory requirements were technically satisfied. B. Due diligence was met because management knowingly accepted operational risks. C. Due diligence failed because foreseeable risks were not proactively addressed. D. Due diligence is irrelevant since engineer did not directly cause derailment. The correct answer is C. Due diligence failed because foreseeable risks were not proactively addressed. The Lac-Mégantic disaster demonstrated that regulatory compliance alone does not equal due diligence when foreseeable risks exist. Courts in R versus Bata Industries confirmed that professionals must take reasonable preventive steps when risks are known. Applying this mindset, the engineer's failure to investigate and mitigate identified hazards constitutes a due diligence failure. Management acceptance does not transfer responsibility. NPPE questions consistently emphasize that due diligence is proactive, requiring action before harm occurs. Therefore, due diligence was not satisfied because warning signs were ignored despite available information. Mindset 12, scenario question. A professional engineer is asked to seal structural drawings prepared by another consultant to meet a construction deadline. The situation resembles Elliott Lake, where approvals were issued without full verification. The engineer performs only a cursory review, trusting the original firm's reputation. After construction, structural deficiencies are discovered. Management claims sealing was procedural and necessary to avoid delays. From a professional practice standpoint, how should the engineer's action be evaluated? A. Acceptable because originating consultant was reputable and experienced. B. Acceptable because project schedule justified the limited review. C. Acceptable because management directed sealing decision. D. Unacceptable because sealing requires adequate independent professional review. The correct answer is D. Unacceptable because sealing requires adequate independent professional review. The Elliott Lake inquiry made clear that improper approval and sealing without adequate review directly endangers public safety. Applying the sealing equals responsibility mindset, the engineer's cursory review does not meet professional obligations. Trusting another firm's reputation or following management direction does not remove accountability. NPPE questions consistently emphasize that sealing signifies ownership of the work. Therefore, sealing without thorough verification constitutes unprofessional conduct and exposes the engineer to discipline and liability. Mindset 13, scenario question. A professional engineer employed by a rail-related contractor becomes aware that staffing reductions and deferred maintenance are increasing operational risk, echoing conditions identified in the Lake Megantic rail disaster. Management insists that all regulatory requirements are technically met and warns the engineer that raising concerns could jeopardize contracts and jobs. No incident has occurred yet. The engineer believes the risk of failure has materially increased. From a professional practice perspective, what is the most appropriate action? A. Raise concerns internally and advocate for corrective safety measures. B. Follow management direction to preserve loyalty and protect company interests. C. Remain silent since regulatory compliance has not been breached. D. Immediately report concerns to media to force public accountability. The correct answer is A. Raise concerns internally and advocate for corrective safety measures. The Lake Megantic disaster demonstrates the dangers of prioritizing corporate convenience over professional judgment. Applying the loyalty has limits mindset. The engineer's duty to the employer does not extend to accepting increased public risk. Regulatory compliance alone does not eliminate professional responsibility. Raising concerns internally is the correct first step, allowing the organization an opportunity to correct unsafe practices. Silence or blind obedience undermines public safety, while immediate media disclosure is premature. NPPE questions consistently emphasize constructive internal action before external escalation. Advocating for corrective measures align loyalty with ethical responsibility and public protection. Mindset 14, scenario question. A consulting engineer is retained for a mining project involving tailings containment near sensitive waterways. The client asks the engineer to guarantee that no environmental release will ever occur, citing concerns after the Syncrude Aurora North Mine incident. The engineer knows geotechnical uncertainty cannot be fully eliminated, but believes risks can be managed through conservative design, monitoring, and contingency planning. From a professional practice perspective, how should the engineer respond? A. Guarantee performance to reassure client and secure project approval. B. Refuse involvement because any risk is unacceptable. C. Explain inherent risks and describe realistic mitigation and monitoring strategies. D. Transfer all environmental risk to contractors through contractual clauses. The correct answer is C. Explain inherent risks and describe realistic mitigation and monitoring strategies. The Syncrude tailings failure demonstrated that denying or obscuring risk does not prevent consequences. Applying the risk management mindset, professionals must acknowledge uncertainty while demonstrating responsible mitigation. Guarantees misrepresent professional capability and increase liability. Refusing involvement misunderstands the nature of professional practice, and transferring all risk ignores continuing professional responsibility. NPPE questions consistently favor transparent communication of risk and mitigation strategies. Explaining how risks will be managed, monitored, and reduced aligns with ethical obligations, protects the public and environment, and maintains trust in professional judgment. Mindset 15. Scenario question. A professional engineer is involved in a resource development project near a sensitive wetland. All environmental permits have been obtained, but the engineer believes additional containment measures would significantly reduce long-term contamination risk, like lessons learned from Canadian tailings pond failures. The clients resist further mitigation due to added cost and schedule impacts. From a professional practice standpoint, how should the engineer proceed? A. Proceed as approved since regulatory requirements have already been met. B. Recommend additional mitigation measures based on professional judgment. C. Withdraw immediately to avoid association with environmental responsibility. D. Implement mitigation quietly without client knowledge. The correct answer is B. Recommend additional mitigation measures based on professional judgment. Canadian environmental incidents demonstrate that regulatory approval does not guarantee environmental protection. Applying the environmental integrity mindset, professionals must act when foreseeable harm exists, even if compliance thresholds are met. Quiet implementation without consent is inappropriate, and withdrawal is unnecessary when responsible engagement remains possible. NPPE questions consistently reward transparent, proactive recommendations grounded in professional judgment. By recommending additional mitigation, the engineer fulfills ethical obligations to society, protects environmental systems, and reinforces public trust in professional stewardship. Mindset 16. Scenario question. A professional engineer uses complex modeling software to design a safety-critical control system for medical equipment. Due to schedule pressure, he relies entirely on default software settings and automated validation checks. No independent calculations or simulations are performed. After deployment, system behavior contributes to patient injury, drawing comparisons to the Canadian development Therac 25 incidents where software errors went unchecked by engineers. Management asserts the software had regulatory approvals and was widely used. From a professional practice perspective, how should responsibility be assessed? A. Responsibility lies with software developer because system performed as coded. B. Responsibility lies with employer for implementing aggressive schedule constraints. C. Responsibility lies with engineer who failed to independently verify and question outputs. D. Responsibility is shared equally across all parties involved in system deployment. The correct answer is C. Responsibility lies with engineer who failed to independently verify and question outputs. The Therac 25 overdoses demonstrated that software failures became professional failures when engineers do not verify, test, and critically assess outputs. Applying the software assist judgment mindset, responsibility rests with the professional who relied on unverified results in a safety-critical application. Software approvals and widespread use do not replace the obligation to understand assumptions and run independent checks. Employer pressure does not transfer accountability. NPPE questions consistently reinforce that the professional user remains responsible for how software is applied. Therefore, failure to validate software behavior constitutes independent professional judgment, making the engineer accountable for resulting harm. Mindset 17, scenario question. A professional engineer working for a rail operations contractor identifies repeated safety control bypasses that increase runaway train risk, resembling conditions preceding the Lac-Mégantic disaster. She documents the issue and reports it to her supervisor and senior management over several months. Management dismisses concerns as overly conservative and takes no corrective action. Although no incident has occurred, the engineer believes the risk to nearby communities remain high. From a professional practice standpoint, what should she do next? A. Take no further action since concerns were already reported internally. B. Resign to avoid association with a potentially dangerous operation. C. Disclose concerns directly to media to force immediate public awareness. D. Report the matter to the appropriate regulatory authority. Taking no action is never an option in these cases. Resigning is never an option. And the correct answer in this question is D. Report the matter to the appropriate regulatory authority. The Lac-Mégantic disaster reveals how ignored warnings and failure to escalate safety concerns can lead to catastrophic loss of life. Applying the duty to inform mindset, the engineer has fulfilled internal obligations by documenting and escalating internally. Continued inaction, while public risk persists, triggers a duty to inform external regulators. Silence or resignation abandons public protection, while media disclosure bypasses proper regulatory processes. NPPE questions consistently treat regulatory reporting as the correct next step once internal remedies fail. By notifying authorities, the engineer protects the public while acting proportionally, ethically, and in accordance with professional obligations. Mindset 18, scenario question. A professional engineer designs an industrial facility that fully satisfies current engineering standards and codes. However, the design does not comply with recently amended environmental legislation imposing stricter containment and reporting requirements. The engineer claims ignorance of the updates and argues that environmental compliance is the responsibility of the owner and regulators, not the design professional. Following an environmental release, regulators investigate, referencing the Bata Industries ruling, where directors and officers were held personally responsible for regulatory non-compliance. From a professional law perspective, how should responsibility be assessed? A. Engineer remains responsible for knowing and complying with applicable law. B. Engineer is not responsible because design met accepted technical standards. C. Responsibility lies only with the owner for operational environmental compliance. D. No breach exists because regulatory inspectors failed to identify non-compliance. The correct answer is A. Engineer remains responsible for knowing and complying with applicable law. R versus Bata Industries established that professionals exercising decision-making authority must take reasonable steps to ensure legal compliance. Applying this mindset, meeting technical standards does not excuse failure to comply with legislation. Engineers are expected to stay informed of legal requirements relevant to their work. Responsibility cannot be shifted entirely to owners or regulators once professional judgment is exercised. NPPE questions consistently reinforce that legality and professionalism are inseparable. Ignorance of statutory obligations exposes professionals to regulatory discipline and legal liability, regardless of compliance with technical codes. Therefore, the engineer remains responsible for ensuring designs comply with applicable law.
Mindset 19, scenario question. A consulting engineer enters into a contract containing a limitation of liability clause that restricts financial exposure. To meet schedule pressure, the engineer knowingly approves work that does not meet accepted professional standards. When failures later occur, the engineer argues that the contract limits responsibility and shields him from consequences. The situation echoes principles from Central Trust Company versus Refuse, where contractual terms did not remove professional duty. From a professional law perspective, which statement is most accurate? A. Professional duty remains regardless of contractual limitation clauses. B. Contract eliminates liability because client accepted risks through agreement. C. Contract supersedes ethical and professional obligations once signed. D. Responsibility transfers entirely to client due to contractual consent. The correct answer is A. Professional duty remains regardless of contractual limitation clauses. Canadian jurisprudence, including Central Trust Company versus Refuse, confirms that professionals cannot contract out of negligence or professional duty. Applying this mindset, limitation of liability clauses allocate financial risk but do not excuse failure to meet professional standards. Approving substandard work violates duty of care regardless of contractual wording. NPPE questions repeatedly emphasize that contracts manage commercial risk, not ethical or legal responsibility. Therefore, the engineer remains accountable for negligent or unprofessional conduct despite contractual protections. The correct focus is professional judgment and public protection, not contractual insulation. Mindset 20 scenario question. A professional engineer designs a retaining structure that complies strictly with all applicable codes. During design, the engineer is aware of unusable subsurface conditions on adjacent properties but does not investigate further, believing code provisions are sufficient. Several years later, the structure fails and damages neighboring buildings, though no injuries occur. The engineer argues that code compliance demonstrates reasonable care and precludes negligence. From a Canadian tort law perspective, how should this situation be evaluated? A. Negligence may exist if reasonable care required investigating foreseeable surface risks. B. No negligence exists because the engineer complied fully with applicable codes. C. Negligence requires intent, which was clearly absent in this situation. D. Liability rests only with property owners for accepting known geological conditions. The correct answer is A. Negligence may exist if reasonable care required investigating foreseeable subsurface risks. Canadian negligence law evaluates conduct against the standard of a reasonably competent professional and not minimal compliance alone. While codes provide evidence of reasonable care, they do not eliminate the duty to act when foreseeable risks are known. Awareness of unusual subsurface conditions created a foreseeable risk to neighboring properties. Failing to investigate further may constitute a breach of the professional standard of care. Intent is irrelevant. Negligence focuses on reasonableness. NPPE questions consistently emphasize that professional judgment must extend beyond mechanical adherence to codes when circumstances warrant additional precautions. Therefore, negligence may be found if further investigation was reasonably required to mitigate foreseeable harm. Mindset 21 scenario question. A professional engineer conducting a preliminary structural assessment identifies significant deterioration in an older public building. The client declined further investigation or repair due to cost and instructs the engineer to limit reporting to internal technical notes. The engineer complies, assuming the owner will manage the risk. Months later, a partial failure occurs, injuring occupants. From a professional law perspective, which statement best reflects the engineer's duty? A. No duty existed because the engineer was not retained for full remediation. B. A duty existed to explicitly warn appropriate parties of foreseeable danger. C. The duty was satisfied by recording findings in technical documentation. D. Responsibility rested solely with the building owner after receiving the report. The correct answer is B. A duty existed to explicitly warn appropriate parties of foreseeable danger. Canadian courts consistently hold that once a professional identifies a foreseeable danger, a duty to warn arises. Merely documenting technical findings does not satisfy this duty if affected parties are not clearly informed. The engineer's obligation persists even if the client refuses corrective action. NPPE questions emphasize that warning must be explicit, timely, and directed to those who can act or are at risk. Assuming others will manage the danger is insufficient. Liability often stems from communication failure rather than initial assessment. Therefore, the engineer had a legal duty to clearly warn appropriate parties of the foreseeable safety risk. Mindset 22 Scenario Question. A professional engineer designed a structural system using methods widely accepted by peers at the time. Years later, the structure experiences a major failure after newer research identifies improved design approaches that would have reduced risk. During litigation, the plaintiff argues the failure proves the engineer was negligent. Expert witnesses are called to assess the engineer's conduct. From a Canadian professional law perspective, how should the engineer's performance be evaluated? A. Negligent because the failure caused significant damage and losses. B. Assessed against reasonable professional practice at the time of design. C. Negligent because better design approaches are now known. D. Assessed using the most current state of the art design knowledge. The correct answer is B. Assessed against reasonable professional practice at the time of design. Canadian courts assess negligence by examining the standard of care at the time the work was performed, not by applying hindsight. The Quebec Bridge inquiries showed negligence arose from ignoring peer warnings available then, not from later knowledge. Applying this mindset, subsequent research or improved techniques do not retroactively define professional standards. Failure alone does not establish negligence if the engineer acted reasonably based on prevailing practice. NPPE questions consistently reinforce this distinction to avoid outcome-based reasoning. Therefore, The engineer's conduct must be judged against what competent peers would have done at that time, making option B correct. Mindset 23 scenario question. A consulting engineer and a client disagree about whether recent defects in a facility stem from design omissions or construction deviations. The client threatens immediate legal action and demands compensation. The engineer believes the issues can be clarified through technical review and notes that no immediate public safety risk exists. Communication channels remain open. From a professional law and practice perspective, what should the engineer do first? A. Commence litigation immediately to protect legal rights and position. B. Pursue negotiation or mediation to clarify responsibilities and resolve dispute. C. Cease communication and wait for formal court proceedings. D. Publicly deny responsibility to protect professional reputation. The correct answer is B. Pursue negotiation or mediation to clarify responsibilities and resolve dispute. Canadian professional practice norms emphasize proportional dispute resolution. Initiating litigation prematurely escalates conflict and increases cost without addressing technical uncertainty. Applying this mindset, negotiation or mediation allows facts to be clarified, responsibilities allocated, and disputes potentially resolved without adversarial proceedings. NPPE questions consistently reward this approach when no immediate safety risk exists and communication is viable. Public denial and silence undermine professionalism and do not resolve the underlying issue. Therefore, pursuing negotiation or mediation as a first step aligns with legal expectations, professional conduct standards, and responsible risk management. Mindset 24 scenario question. A professional engineer employed by a consulting firm develops a proprietary design spreadsheet while working on company projects using firm software and data. After resigning, the engineer attempts to market the tool independently, claiming ownership because she developed it personally and no explicit IP clause existed in her employment agreement. The former employer objects, citing Canadian employment law principles. From a professional law perspective, which statement best reflects likely outcomes? A. Engineer owns tool because authorship determines intellectual property rights. B. Employer likely owns tool because it was created during employment. C. Ownership depends solely on whether copyright was formally registered. D. Ownership automatically transfers to engineer upon leaving employment. The correct answer is B. Employer likely owns tool because it was created during employment. Canadian courts generally find that intellectual property created in the course of employment belongs to the employer, even if no explicit IP clause exists. Use of company time, tools, resources, and assigned duties strongly indicates employer ownership. Personal authorship alone is insufficient to establish ownership. IP registration affects enforcement, not entitlement. Applying this mindset, the engineer cannot assume ownership simply because she created the tool. NPPE questions consistently emphasized understanding contextual legal principles governing IP and avoiding intuitive but incorrect assumptions. Therefore, the firm would likely retain ownership of the design tool. Mindset 25 Scenario Question. A professional engineer employed by a utility company follows managerial instructions that lead to the release of substandard design work. After complaints arise, the engineer argues that the employer bears sole responsibility because she did not negotiate contracts or act independently. The regulator initiates a professional conduct review. From a professional law perspective, which statement is correct? A. Only employers may be disciplined because they control project decisions. B. Employees are immune from professional discipline when acting under instructions. C. Employment status does not eliminate personal professional accountability. D. Discipline is limited to managers who authorize design decisions. The correct answer is C. Employment status does not eliminate personal professional accountability. Canadian professional law principles establish that licensure carries personal accountability regardless of employment agreement. While employers may share liability, they do not shield individuals from regulatory discipline. Following instructions does not excuse unprofessional conduct or substandard practice. NPPE questions repeatedly emphasize that regulators discipline individuals based on conduct, not corporate role. Applying this mindset, the engineer remains professionally accountable for her work, even as an employee. Therefore, employment status does not remove personal obligation to uphold professional standards, making option C correct. Mindset 26 Scenario Question. A senior engineer argues that a particular engineering activity has been performed for decades without registration in a sector and that industry practice should prevail over new regulatory enforcement. He claims employer approval and technical competence justify continuing the work without licensure, despite clear wording in the Provincial Professional Engineers Act restricting such activities to licensed practitioners. He also argues that association bylaws are merely guidance, not enforceable law. From a professional law perspective, how should this be interpreted? A. Industry custom can override statutory requirements if widely accepted. B. Employer authorization may replace statutory licensure requirements. C. Professional bylaws are optional and lack legal enforceability. D. Statutory law governs practice regardless of tradition or convenience. The correct answer is D. Statutory law governs practice regardless of tradition or convenience. In Canada, professional authority originates solely from statute. Professional acts enacted by legislatures define licensing requirements, scope of practice, and discipline powers. Industry tradition and employer approval do not override statutory obligations. Bylaws derive authority from legislation and are enforceable, not optional. Canadian regulators consistently discipline professionals who rely on custom instead of law. NPPE questions deliberately include arguments based on historical practice to test understanding of statutory supremacy. When legislation clearly restricts practice to license individuals, compliance is mandatory. Therefore, statutory law governs professional practice regardless of industry habit or organizational preference. Mindset 27 scenario question. A highly experienced engineer relocates to another province and immediately begins offering engineering services while awaiting registration approval. He argues that his previous licensure, years of experience, and employer support demonstrate competence and that delays are bureaucratic. He also uses the professional title in correspondence. The regulator later investigates. From a professional law perspective, which statement best reflects proper interpretation? A. Practice and title use require formal licensure before approval. B. Prior licensure permits temporary practice while registration is processed. C. Experience alone authorizes practice despite pending registration status. D. Mobility agreements eliminate the need for interim regulatory control. The correct answer is A. Practice and title use require formal licensure before approval. Canadian professional law is clear. Licensure must be granted before practice or title use in any jurisdiction. Mobility agreements facilitate transfer, but do not suspend regulatory authority or permit interim practice. Experience and employer support do not replace legislative requirements. Using protected titles before approval misleads the public and undermines regulatory oversight. NPPE questions consistently reject arguments that competence substitutes for licensure. Regulators may impose conditions or delays precisely to protect public interest. Therefore, practice and title use must wait until formal licensure is granted, making option A correct. Mindset 28 scenario question. An unlicensed engineering graduate works for a consulting firm under general supervision. She prepares technical designs that influence public-facing infrastructure projects and signs emails as project engineer to convey authority when communicating with clients. Her manager is aware of the title use and believes it is harmless because the graduate does not seal drawings and no errors have occurred. No clients have complained. From a professional law perspective, which statement best reflects the situation? A. Acceptable because supervision exists and no public harm has occurred. B. Acceptable because the title reflects internal job responsibilities only. C. Unacceptable because protected titles and professional practice require licensure. D. Acceptable if the employer assumes responsibility for all communications. The correct answer is C. Unacceptable because protected titles and professional practice require licensure. Canadian professional acts restrict both title use and professional practice to license individuals to protect the public. Applying this mindset, using project engineer implies licensure and can mislead clients regardless of intent or outcome. Supervision and lack of harm do not legalize title misuse. Employer approval cannot override statutory restrictions. Regulators discipline title misuse proactively because public trust depends on clarity around who is licensed and accountable. NPPE questions consistently emphasize that violations occur at the moment of misuse, not when damage happens. Therefore, the conduct is unacceptable, making option C correct. Mindset 29. Scenario question. A professional engineer argues that because she is a senior member of an internationally recognized engineering society that publishes respected technical standards, she does not need to comply strictly with provincial registration requirements. She claims peer review, continuing education, and the society's ethical code provide sufficient oversight. A regulator later questioned her compliance. From a professional law perspective, which interpretation is correct? A. Compliance is optional if international best practices are followed. B. Technical societies may replace regulators when standards and ethics are robust. C. Membership provides equivalent authority to practice professionally. D. Only statutory professional regulators have authority to license and discipline. The correct answer is D. Only statutory professional regulators have authority to license and discipline. Technical societies contribute to professional development but have no legal authority to license or regulate professional practice in Canada. Applying this mindset, only regulators established by statute may grant licensure, define scope, and enforce discipline. Ethical codes and standards from technical organizations do not replace statutory obligations. NPPE questions consistently draw this distinction to ensure candidates understand the source of professional authority. Assuming that society membership substitutes for licensure undermines public protection and violates professional law. Therefore, regulatory authority remains exclusively with provincial and territorial associations, making option D the correct answer. Mindset 30. Scenario question. A professional engineer mistakenly issues a final engineering letter without the required review steps described in her firm's quality procedure. No incident occurs and the client suffers no loss. A member of the public filed a complaint with the regulator after seeing the letter relied on in a municipal decision. The engineer argues that discipline should not proceed because the error was unintentional, caused no harm, and she has an excellent practice history. She also believes discipline is meant to punish bad actors, not correct procedural mistakes. From a regulation and discipline perspective, how should the regulator's role be understood? A. Discipline should proceed only if harm or damages can be proven. B. Discipline exists mainly to punish and deter deliberate wrongdoing. C. Discipline protects the public by addressing breaches even without harm. D. Discipline is unnecessary if the engineer acted honestly and promptly. The correct answer is C. Discipline protects the public by addressing breaches even without harm. PEO's discipline framework exists to maintain high standards of practice and ethics and to discipline professional misconduct or incompetence through a structured complaint and hearing process. Regardless of whether harm occurred, applying the mindset, prevention, and public confidence are central. Procedural breaches can reveal system weaknesses that could later produce harm, so regulators act before tragedy occurs. Intent and prior record may reduce penalties, but they do not remove accountability. NPPE questions frequently test the misconception that no harm means no discipline. The correct reasoning is that discipline protects the public by addressing breaches of standards and reinforcing professional expectations even when consequences were avoided by luck.
Mindset 31, scenario question. A licensed professional is randomly selected for a regulator practice review. She assumes selection implies wrongdoing and tells colleagues it is a disciplinary audit. She considers refusing participation because no complaints exist and she believes her work quality is excellent. The regulator explains that practice reviews may check competence, CPD practices, and adherence to standards, and that serious findings can be referred for investigation. From a regulation perspective, what is the best interpretation and response? A. Refuse participation because practice review is voluntary without active complaints. B. Treat it as discipline and prepare legal defense instead of cooperation. C. Cooperate fully, viewing the review as preventive quality assurance. D. Ignore requests because regulators only review after public incidents occur. Mindset 32, scenario question. A senior engineer argues that 25 years of experience makes formal CPD unnecessary. He attends occasional informal lunch and learns but keeps no records. During annual renewal, the regulator requests evidence of CPD completion and a competency plan explaining that CPD is mandatory for practicing licensees and non-compliance can affect good standing. The engineer responds that his projects have had no failures and that CPD is paperwork. From a regulatory and discipline perspective, what is the most accurate conclusion? A. CPD is optional for senior professionals who demonstrate competent work performance. B. CPD is required only after incidents, complaints, or major technical failures. C. CPD is mandatory and must be documented to maintain good standing. D. Informal learning is sufficient so long as the engineer claims experience. The correct answer is C. CPD is mandatory and must be documented to maintain good standing. APEGA states CPD is mandatory under its governing act and is part of maintaining good standing, emphasizing accountability through competence planning and documentation. Engineers Nova Scotia similarly requires annual PDHs and warns non-compliance can result in removal from the registry and loss of title or practice rights. Applying the mindset, experience, and no failures do not replace structured learning and proof of competence maintenance. NPPE questions repeatedly rejects the idea that CPD is optional or triggered only by incidents. The accurate conclusion is that CPD is mandatory and must be documented. Non-compliance is unprofessional and threatens licensure standing. Mindset 33, scenario question. A professional engineer begins providing engineering services to external clients through a newly incorporated company. He holds a valid license and believes his personal status satisfies regulatory requirements. The company does not apply for a certificate of authorization, relying instead on contracts stating that the engineer takes full responsibility. No complaints arise. From a professional law perspective, which statement is most accurate? A. The company must hold a certificate of authorization to offer services. B. Personal licensure replaces the need for organizational authorization. C. Contracts can transfer authorization obligations away from regulators. D. Authorization is unnecessary if no public complaints are received. The correct answer is A. The company must hold a certificate of authorization to offer services. Regulators require certificates of authorization to ensure organizations offering professional services maintain supervision, quality control, and accountability. Personal licensure does not replace this requirement. Contractual disclaimers do not override statutory obligations. NPPE questions emphasize that authorization requirements exist to protect the public proactively, not to respond after harm occurs. Offering services without a certificate violates professional law regardless of outcome. Therefore, the company must obtain proper authorization. Mindset 34 Scenario question. A civil engineer with no geotechnical background agrees to design deep foundations to help a long-time client meet schedule demands. She performs online research and relies on software outputs but does not consult a specialist. The design technically functions but later shows excessive settlement. From a professional practice perspective, how should these conducts be evaluated? A. Acceptable because the engineer acted in good faith. B. Acceptable if the design met minimum technical requirements. C. Acceptable since no immediate safety incident occurred. D. Unacceptable because the engineer practiced beyond her competence. The correct answer is D. Unacceptable because the engineer practiced beyond her competence. Professional competence is a foundational obligation. Practicing outside one's expertise without appropriate consultation violates professional standards regardless of intent or outcome. NPPE questions consistently reject justifications based on effort or self education when specialized competence is required. The appropriate response would have been to refuse the work or engage a qualified specialist. Therefore, the conduct constitutes practicing beyond competence. Mindset 35 Scenario question. An engineer circulates draft structural drawings to multiple stakeholders without marking them as preliminary. A contractor relies on the drawings and begins fabrication. Errors are discovered late. The engineer argues the documents were clearly incomplete and unsealed. From a professional responsibility standpoint, which statement is correct? A. Responsibility lies with contractor for using unfinished documents. B. The engineer failed to clearly identify document as preliminary. C. No responsibility exists because documents were not sealed. D. Draft documents never require professional controls. The correct answer is B. The engineer failed to clearly identify documents as preliminary. Professionals must manage the use of their work products. Failing to clearly identify documents as preliminary create foreseeable misuse. Sealing is not the only control mechanism. NPPE questions consistently require proactive document control. Therefore, the engineer bears responsibility for failing to properly label and manage draft documents. Mindset 36 Scenario question. An engineer learns that confidential test results revealed serious safety defects. Management instructs her not to disclose the information externally. The defect poses foreseeable risk to the public. From a professional ethics and law perspective, what obligation applies? A. Maintain confidentiality regardless of potential public harm. B. Confidentiality may be overridden to protect public safety. C. Disclose internally only and take no further action. D. Ignore the issues unless legally compelled by court order. The correct answer is B. Confidentiality may be overridden to protect public safety. Professional confidentiality does not override the duty to protect the public. NPPE questions emphasize proportionate disclosure when serious risks exist. Maintaining silence would constitute unethical conduct. Disclosure must be justified and appropriate, but cannot be avoided when public safety is threatened. Mindset 37 scenario question. A professional engineer advertises herself as Canada's leading expert in a specialty without objective evidence. No complaints occur. From a professional ethics perspective, how should this be viewed? A. Acceptable as standard marketing language. B. Unacceptable because claims are unverifiable and misleading. C. Acceptable unless competitors object. D. Acceptable if technically competent. The correct answer is B. Unacceptable because claims are unverifiable and misleading. Professional advertising must be factual and verifiable. NPPE questions consistently reject promotional exaggeration. Misleading claims erode public trust even without harm. Therefore, the advertisement is unethical. Mindset 38. Scenario question. An engineer delegates calculations to a junior employee and approves results without review. Errors later emerge. Who bears responsibility? A. Junior employee who performed calculations. B. Employer for staffing decisions. C. Supervising professional who approved the work. D. No one because delegation was reasonable. The correct answer is C. Supervising professional who approved the work. Approval signifies acceptance of responsibility. Delegation does not absolve oversight duties. NPPE questions consistently assign accountability to supervisors. Mindset 39 scenario question. An engineer performs private consulting work on weekends without notifying the regulator or employer. The work is competent. Which statement is correct? A. Potentially illegal without proper authorization. B. Acceptable because work occurs outside normal employment. C. Acceptable if no conflict exists. D. Acceptable for small projects only. The correct answer is A. potentially illegal without proper authorization. Professional obligations apply regardless of timing. Unauthorized practice undermines regulatory oversight. NPPE questions consistently treat moonlighting as regulated activity. Mindset 40. Scenario question. Facing ambiguous options, an engineer asks which choice best aligns with professional duty. What guiding test should be applied? A. Which option benefits the employer most? B. Which option best protects public confidence? C. Which option minimizes personal risk? D. Which option avoids additional work? The correct answer is B. Which option best protects public confidence? Public confidence underpins self-regulation, ethics, law, and discipline. NPPE questions consistently reward decisions that reinforce trust. When uncertain, the correct choice protects public confidence.
Mindset 41. Scenario question. A professional engineer designs infrastructure for a resource development project near traditional indigenous lands. All environmental permits have been issued, and the client states that consultation obligations have been legally satisfied. During planning, the engineer becomes aware that construction may disrupt culturally significant land using patterns and water access. The client insists consultation is a legal issue, not an engineering concern, and directs the engineer to proceed without further consideration. No law appears immediately violated. From a professional responsibility perspective, what should guide the engineer's response? A. Proceed, since permits were issued and consultation is a client responsibility. B. Proceed, but document concerns internally for record keeping only. C. Withdraw immediately without explanation to avoid involvement. D. Advise the client of potential impacts and the need for meaningful consultation. The correct answer is D. Advise the client of potential impacts and the need for meaningful consultation. Indigenous consultation is both a legal and professional responsibility when projects may affect protected rights or public interest. Permits do not eliminate the obligation to exercise independent professional judgment. NPPE questions reject reasoning that confines consultation to legal compliance alone. Professionals must identify foreseeable impacts, communicate them clearly, and support informed consultation processes. Silence or passive documentation fails public interest duties, while immediate withdrawal bypasses professional responsibility. Advising the client and advocating for meaningful consultation aligns with ethical obligations, reconciliation principles, and the profession's role in protecting public trust and long-term societal interests.
Mindset 42. Scenario question. A professional engineer becomes aware that a senior colleague repeatedly makes discriminatory remarks towards a junior team member. The engineer is not the supervisor and the conduct does not affect technical deliverables. Management advises that HR will handle it eventually and discourages further involvement to avoid conflict. No formal complaint has been filed. From a professional ethics perspective, what is the most appropriate course of action? A. Do nothing since the engineer is not directly involved. B. Accept management's assurance and avoid interference. C. Publicly confront the colleague during a team meeting. D. Raise concerns through appropriate organizational or regulatory channels. The correct answer is D. Raise concerns through appropriate organizational or regulatory channels. Professional responsibilities include promoting equitable treatment and preventing harm in the workplace. NPPE questions emphasize that harassment is not merely a HR matter when professionals are aware of ongoing misconduct. Silence enables harm and erodes trust. While public confrontation may escalate conflict, appropriate internal escalation and documentation align with professional obligations. If internal mechanisms fail, regulatory guidance may be required. Deferring responsibility contradicts ethical duties under codes of ethics and human rights principles. Therefore, raising concerns through appropriate channels is the correct professional response. Mindset 43 Scenario Question. A consulting engineer identifies a design option with known performance uncertainty. Management supports proceeding, noting that the firm maintains comprehensive errors and omission insurance and that litigation risk is manageable. The engineer believes safer alternatives exist but would increase cost and schedule. No standard is strictly violated. From a professional practice perspective, how should the engineer evaluate management's reliance on insurance? A. Reject the reasoning and base decisions on professional judgment. B. Accept the risk since insurance transfers financial liability. C. Proceed because no regulation is explicitly breached. D. Proceed but add contractual disclaimers to reduce exposure. The correct answer is A. Reject the reasoning and base decisions on professional judgment. NPPE questions consistently emphasize that insurance does not change professional obligations or standards of care. Insurance addresses consequences after failure. It does not justify accepting foreseeable risk. Disclaimers and contracts do not remove accountability once judgment is exercised. Even in the absence of regulatory breach, professionals must recommend safer alternatives when reasonable. Management reliance on insurance reflects flawed risk reasoning. Therefore, the engineer must base decisions on competent professional judgment, not on financial risk transfer mechanisms. Mindset 44 Scenario Question. A professional engineer is retained as an expert witness in litigation involving a structural failure. During case preparation, Legal counsel encourages emphasizing interpretations that favor the client and minimizing uncertainties. The client's independent analysis identifies factors that weaken the client's position. The engineer is reminded that continued engagement depends on supportive testimony. From a professional and legal perspective, what is the correct response? A. Adjust testimony to align with the client's legal strategy. B. Provide natural, objective option regardless of impact on client. C. Withdraw quietly and avoid submitting an opinion. D. Limit testimony to areas explicitly requested by counsel. The correct answer is B. Provide neutral, objective opinion regardless of impact on client. Expert witnesses owe a duty of impartiality to the court. NPPE questions consistently reject client advocacy reasoning in expert roles. Adjusting testimony compromises professional integrity and may attract discipline. Quiet withdrawal avoids responsibility without correcting potential misuse of expertise. Limiting testimony does not justify omission of relevant professional judgment. Providing a neutral, objective opinion, clearly explaining uncertainties, is the only response consistent with ethical codes, legal expectations, and public trust in the profession. Mindset 45, scenario question. An engineer uses an AI-assisted design tool that optimizes structural layout. Under schedule pressure, outputs are accepted without independent verification. After construction, unexpected performance issues emerge. The engineer argues that the AI tool was industry approved and widely used. From a professional practice standpoint, how should responsibility be assessed? A. Responsibility lies with the AI developer. B. Responsibility remains with the engineer who applied the tool. C. Responsibility is shared equally among all project participants. D. Responsibility is limited because AI tools are inherently uncertain. The correct answer is B. Responsibility remains with the engineer who applied the tool. NPPE questions consistently assign responsibility to the professional exercising judgment, not to tools or vendors. AI outputs require validation, understanding of assumptions, and independent review. Industry use does not eliminate professional duty. Uncertainty increases the need for verification. It does not excuse failure to act. Responsibility remains with the engineer who relied on unverified results in a public-facing application. Therefore, the engineer is professionally accountable for the outcome. Mindset 46, scenario question. A professional engineer applies an electronic seal to final drawings submitted through a digital project platform. Review time was limited, and another team member made last-minute changes after sealing. Issues are later discovered. Management argues that e-sealing is a procedural formality and that responsibility is shared by the team. From a professional responsibility standpoint, what is correct? A. Sealing signifies full responsibility regardless of format. B. Electronic sealing carries reduced responsibility. C. Responsibility transferred when others modified the file. D. Responsibility lies with the platform administrators. The correct answer is A. Sealing signifies full responsibility regardless of format. Electronic seals carry full legal and ethical weight. NPPE questions emphasize that sealing, digital or physical, signifies ownership of the work. Failure to control revisions or verify content before sealing constitutes professional misconduct. Team processes and platforms do not transfer responsibility away from the sealing professional. Therefore, full accountability rests with the engineer who applied the electronic seal. Thank you very much, and do not hesitate to contact us if you require help with becoming a P.Eng, and would like to use this opportunity to wish you the very best in your professional engineering career. Goodbye and see you soon.